Savonarola was a Dominican priest. He was a reformer of the church shortly before Martin Luther's time. Martin Luther, you remember, in the year 1517, what's that, 506 years ago, nailed the theses, his 95 Theses, to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel, and that's the day that we recognize on October 31st. And so that's the day we remember as Reformation Day. But Savonarola was one of those people, and there were several of them, who started the Reformation earlier than that key moment. There were some in Eastern Europe, and then Savonarola was burned at the stake when Martin Luther was still a teenager. For years, he was a powerful person in Florence, Italy. And early in his pastorate, Savonarola noticed an elderly woman who came to the cathedral every day before Mass and knelt before the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary to pray for an hour on her knees. Savonarola mentioned her devotion to an old priest who had served the cathedral for decades. And the old priest smiled and said, "Things are not always what they seem." Years ago, this woman was the model for the statue of the Virgin. She's not worshiping God. She's worshiping who she used to be. That, of course, is the danger for Protestants on Reformation Day, that we worship who we used to be rather than the one who created us, who redeemed us, and who sustains us. A few years ago, I took a trip with one of my colleague groups to New York, where we visited with two different pastors of two different churches, two Presbyterian churches that were founded before the American Revolution, one on Fifth Avenue and one Old Brick. The presidents of the United States, famous literary figures, and pastors whose names you would recognize, Harry Emerson Fosdick and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, worshiped in their churches or preached from their pews, from their pulpits. In our visit with one of the pastors, a friend asked Scott, the pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, "What's the greatest challenge to your ministry here?" And he answered, "Building on our history instead of worshiping it." Back in the 1960s, when Muhammad Ali was still Cassius Clay, he boarded an airplane with a bunch of reporters, and he was very much in his Showtime form. He was bragging and joking and carrying on, and the flight attendant came and said, "Mr. Clay," he wasn't Muhammad Ali yet, she said, "You're going to need to fasten your seatbelt." And he said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." And she said, "Superman doesn't need an airplane." What's true for Muhammad Ali on an airplane, what's true for Scott Black Johnson in the pulpit of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York, and what's true for Savonarola in Florence, is true for all Protestants. That neither we nor our ancestors in the faith are an adequate substitute for God. No thing, no substance, no amount of money, no person, no matter how wonderful, can fill that God-shaped hole in our souls. Only God, who made us, redeemed us, and sustains us, can do this. So how do we walk this fine line? How do we honor our fathers and mothers in the faith on Reformation Day without idolizing them? Well, first of all, I think we can hear this gospel lesson from John. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Within this brief gospel passage, Jesus lifts up two parts to this truth. First, the truth that we are slaves to sin. I know, I don't want to hear that. I'm right there with the disciples of Jesus who protest, "What are you talking about, Jesus? We're children of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anybody." Well, I'm right there with them, but I'm right there conveniently forgetting about our slavery as children of Abraham, slavery under the Egyptians before Moses, under the Babylonians before Cyrus, and under the Romans at the time that John was written. And that's not all. I really want to forget about slavery to pride and greed and wrath and gluttony and all those other deadly sins that I will not elaborate with personal illustrations. The human heart is a factory of idols. And at the heart of the gospel, Jesus leads us to this truth, that if we're not always focused on God, then we'll open the door for something else to come in and take God's place. A few years ago, George Barna, who's a researcher, he's kind of like the Christian version of Gallup polls. And so he did a poll. He asked a cross-section of average Americans, what are the most important words you've ever heard? And number one, no surprise, was, I love you. And number two, I forgive you. And number three, dinner's ready, come eat. These three phrases, I love you, I forgive you, and dinner's ready, come eat, reminds us why we're here. They tell us why we're needed in the community and what we're called to do and to be here. First, I love you. David Luce, a professor at Luther Seminary, tells of a painful memory with his brother in their teenage years. They were out in the yard playing soccer. And in the course of playing together, things got very physical and then heated, and then he pushed his brother, and push came to shove, and he hit him. He hit his younger brother, and his brother just stood there. And he says, come on, fight back, hit me back. And he says, no. He says, come on, take a swing, I dare you. And the younger brother shakes his head from side to side and says, no. And David, enraged at being denied, he moves forward, he shoves him harder than before. Come on, hit me. And his brother says, no, I will not hit my brother. I will not hit my brother. I can't hit you, David. I love you. David writes, how do we respond to God's offer of forgiveness? One would think that the pardoned sinner, like the pardoned criminal, would gratefully and earnestly mend his or her ways. Then one would think that being confronted by my younger brother's word of love, I would have immediately acknowledged my poor behavior and tried to make amends. But no, instead, David says, I got into the car and I drove away, leaving him to walk the 4 miles home. He said, as I was pulling away, I looked over and saw my brother with the soccer ball tucked under his arm, walking home with his head bowed down in pain, tears still streaming down his face, and I stopped. Not because I wanted to. No, not even then did I want to stop, but I could do no other, for finally his love had what? Won me over? Exactly the opposite. Finally his love had broken my will, killed that arrogant, prideful, and insecure self that demands to always be in control. Isn't that always the way it is? We're no different. I will not hit my brother. I love you. I will remember your sin no more. To the one who's unprepared to admit defeat, to admit his or her need for forgiveness, even the purest words of grace sound like an offense. And so God has to wrest control from us, must, in a sense, kill the old self of ourselves, kill that old self with grace, that we may be raised to new life. And that's our calling as children of the Reformation, to tell the world that God is love. It just is so out of step with the world that is on fire and at war. To continue to say that God is love. It is out of step with the world, and that is the point, that the world needs what we have to say. The world needs what we have received from Jesus Christ, to know that God, who created us, who redeems us, who sustains us, God is love, and that is the ultimate force in the world. We just have to keep on saying it to one another and to the world. I love you. I forgive you. The only thing that will reach us in a state of broken will, of knowing our own arrogance, pride, and insecurity, is a clear message that God's love is greater than our failure and greater than any human failure. The cross stands at the center of our life because it's a startling and sober reminder that God's love is free but not cheap. God's love cost the life of Jesus, who was willing to suffer and die that we could be forgiven and live. Dinner's ready. Let's eat. We use the word communion so much to refer to the Lord's Supper that sometimes we forget that it has layers of meanings. It also refers to the connection and the community that we have with God and with each other, a connection and a community that exists at all times and all places. The gathering for the meal is a celebration and a strengthening of reality that never ceases to be true. We gather to remind ourselves that we are a community that's united to, connected to Christ and to one another and to all believers throughout time and space. That's why when we celebrate communion, this Wednesday evening, All Saints' Day service, 7:30, Faure's Requiem, and next Sunday, the table will be as it always is in our denomination. It will be open and inviting to all, calling us back time and again to the place where God's love and forgiveness are made real and touchable in bread and wine. There's a guy named Delmer Chilton. He's one of the founders of the podcast Two Bubbas and a Bible. And he tells of when his two sons were 10 and 7 and he overheard them talking about, arguing, I guess some kids argue about this, how frequently communion ought to be celebrated. I don't remember my kids ever talking about this, but Delmer Chilton's did. And the oldest, the 10-year-old, says, well, it takes too long, and if you do it every Sunday, it's not special. And someone's got to prepare, somebody's got to clean up, and all of that. And the youngest said, well, you can only say that because you're good. I'm a mean little kid, and I need all the forgiveness I can get. Robert Frost once said, home's the place that when you have to go there, they have to let you in. We are the world's true home. We're not here to worship who we used to be, but to worship God. The church doesn't exist just for the benefit of those of us who are here today or online joining us. The congregation exists as God's instrument for the salvation of those out there. It exists as an outpost of the kingdom of God, as a sign of God's love, as an agent of God's forgiveness, as an open table where God's hungry children can be fed. We are the world's true home, and it's our calling to cry out that invitation to the world. God is love. You are forgiven, and dinner's ready. Come eat. Thanks be to God. Amen.